was the summer of 2018, and I desperately needed a break. My friends, Jason, Emily, Sarah, and I decided to rent a lake house deep in the woods for a week. The place looked perfect in the photos. Rustic, peaceful, and right by the water. But when we arrived, something felt off. The house looked older and more worn than in the pictures, with peeling paint and grimy windows. The lake was eerily still, and the air felt heavy. Jason found the key under a loose brick on the front steps, just as the owner had instructed. We stepped inside to find a dimly lit interior with old mismatched furniture and a musty smell. Despite the unsettling vibe, we tried to settle in. That first night, the atmosphere grew even more tense. We gathered in the living room, trying to relax, but the wind outside was howling, making the windows rattle. As we sat there, I kept hearing a faint tapping noise coming from one of the windows. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or tree branches, but the sound was rhythmic and deliberate. I turned to look, but there was nothing outside. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I kept it to myself. Later, as I lay in bed, the tapping started again, louder this time. It sounded like fingers drumming on the glass. I tried to ignore it, but it continued for what felt like hours before finally stopping. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. The window by my bed was slightly open, even though I didn't remember opening it. I joined the others for breakfast, trying to shake off the lingering dread. After we ate, we decided to explore the area around the lake. The day was beautiful, but the silence was unnerving. Jason found an old, rusted tackle box floating in the water, and inside were a bunch of crudely carved wooden figures. They looked unsettling, almost grotesque. Jason joked that they were probably left by the last person who stayed there, but none of us were laughing. The cheerful mood from earlier in the day was gone, replaced by a sense of unease. That evening, the tapping noise returned, even louder than the night before. It wasn't just one window this time. It seemed to be coming from all around the house. The sound was rhythmic and constant, like someone or something was trying to get our attention. Jason tried to brush it off, but I could tell he was just as scared as the rest of us. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, and the house creaked and groaned like it was alive. I felt trapped, like we were being watched. But there was nothing we could do but wait it out. The next few days were filled with a growing sense of dread. Every night, the tapping continued, and we began to hear other noises as well. Footsteps on the creaky floorboards, doors opening and closing on their own, and faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. We tried to keep ourselves busy during the day, but the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Emily and Sarah started talking about leaving early, but Jason insisted that we stick it out. He didn't want to admit that something was wrong, but I could see the fear in his eyes. One night, things took a turn for the worse. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the tapping, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, low and guttural, whispering my name. I sat up, my heart pounding, and strained to hear. The voice was faint, almost like it was coming from inside my head, but it was clear enough to send chills down my spine. I got up and checked the window, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, and the door was still locked. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the voice stayed with me, repeating my name over and over until I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I told Jason and the others about the voice, but they looked at me like I was crazy. Jason tried to reassure me that it was just the house playing tricks on my mind, but I could tell he didn't really believe it. We all knew something was wrong, but none of us wanted to admit it. That day, I noticed that the lake was no longer calm and still. It was churning, the water murky and dark, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. The atmosphere around the house was thick with tension, and I felt like we were being watched, not just by the house, but by something else, something unseen. That night, the tapping and the voices grew louder, more insistent. I was lying in bed, trying to block out the noise, when I heard footsteps outside my door. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I held my breath, hoping they would go away, but the footsteps stopped right outside my door. I waited, listening intently, but there was only silence. I thought maybe it was Jason checking on me, but when I called out his name, there was no response. I slowly got up and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The next day, we decided it was time to leave. The house had become unbearable, and we couldn't take it anymore. We packed our things in a hurry, eager to get out as quickly as possible. But as we were loading up the car, I noticed something that made my heart stop. The figure from the lake was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was the first time I had seen it clearly, and it was even more terrifying than I had imagined. It was tall and thin, with long, bony limbs and a face that was barely human. Its eyes were hollow and dark, and it seemed to be grinning at us, like it knew something we didn't. We didn't waste any time getting in the car and speeding away. As we drove down the gravel road, the house disappeared from view, swallowed up by the trees. But the feeling of dread stayed with us, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. We drove in silence for a long time, none of us daring to speak. Finally, Jason broke the silence, saying that we had made the right decision to leave. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had left something behind, something that was still watching us, waiting for us to come back. When we finally reached the nearest town, we checked into a motel for the night. None of us wanted to be alone, so we all stayed in the same room. As we lay there in the dark, the events of the past few days replayed in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if we had stayed. I didn't sleep at all that night, too afraid that the tapping and the voices would follow us. The next day, we drove home, relieved to be away from the lake house. But the memories of that week have stayed with me ever since. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something from that house is still with us, something that we can't escape. It was the middle of July, and I had just gotten back from a stressful business trip. My girlfriend, Claire, suggested we take a weekend trip to a cabin in the woods that she found online. It was supposed to be a quiet, secluded spot where we could disconnect and relax. The idea sounded perfect, so we booked it and headed out the following Friday. The drive was long, with winding roads that seemed to take us further into the wilderness. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the dense forest surrounding the cabin. The cabin itself was small and rustic, with a front porch that looked out onto a clearing. Despite the isolation, something about the place felt cozy, and I was looking forward to the weekend. The first night was peaceful. We made dinner, sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest, and eventually went to bed early. The cabin was so quiet that I could hear the occasional rustling of leaves outside and the soft creaking of the wooden beams settling. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. My heart started racing as I lay there, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the footsteps continued, moving closer to the door. I held my breath, listening intently. But after a few moments, the sound stopped. I eventually drifted back to sleep, but the feeling of unease lingered. The next morning, I mentioned the footsteps to Claire, but she brushed it off, saying it was probably just a deer or some other animal. We spent the day hiking through the forest, exploring the area around the cabin. The woods were thick and overgrown, with trails that hadn't been used in years. We didn't see another soul all day, which was both eerie and calming at the same time. By the time we got back to the cabin, the sun was setting, and a sense of unease began to creep back in. The isolation that had felt refreshing at first was now starting to feel more like a trap. That evening, as we sat on the porch, the air grew thick with tension. The forest, which had been full of life earlier in the day, was now eerily silent. No birds, no insects. Just the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Claire suggested we go inside, and as we did, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd closed it when we left. I didn't mention it to Claire, not wanting to worry her, but the unease I felt the night before returned tenfold. As we sat in the cabin, the silence outside was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, I woke up again, but this time to a different sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. My heart pounded as I lay there, trying to convince myself it was just a branch or something harmless. But the tapping was too deliberate, too steady. I slowly got out of bed and approached the window, my breath catching in my throat. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside, but there was nothing there, just darkness and the faint outline of the trees. The tapping stopped as soon as I looked, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. The next day, Claire noticed I was on edge. I told her about the tapping, but she tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just the wind. We decided to spend the day at the cabin, taking it easy after our long hike the day before. But I couldn't relax. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards put me on high alert. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The back door, which we hadn't touched all weekend, was slightly open. I knew for a fact that we hadn't used it, and there was no reason for it to be open. I locked the door and double-checked all the windows, making sure everything was secure. Claire noticed my nervousness and suggested we watch a movie to take our minds off things. We settled on the couch, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the open doors, the footsteps, the tapping. As the movie played, I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something staring back at me. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and I could tell Claire was starting to feel it too. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened as the door slowly swung open, followed by soft, deliberate footsteps entering the cabin. I held my breath, praying that it was just my imagination. But the sound was too real, too close. I reached over to wake Claire, but before I could, the footsteps stopped right outside our bedroom door. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, waiting for something, anything to happen. But after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, and the front door creaked shut. The next morning, we decided to leave. The unease had become too much to bear, and neither of us could shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As we packed our bags, I noticed scratches on the front door, deep and jagged, as if someone or something had been trying to claw its way in. I didn't mention it to Claire, not wanting to scare her even more. We hurriedly loaded the car and drove away, leaving the cabin behind us. As we pulled onto the main road, I looked back one last time and saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. It was tall and thin, with long, bony limbs and a face that I couldn't quite make out. We drove in silence for a long time, the tension in the car almost as thick as it had been in the cabin. Neither of us spoke, too shaken by the events of the past few days. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure following us. But the road behind us was empty. We didn't stop until we reached a motel several hours away. As we checked in, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrible, something that was still out there, waiting. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards set my nerves on edge. I kept replaying the events of the weekend in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. The footsteps, the tapping, the open doors, it all felt like a nightmare. But I knew it had been real. The next morning, we continued our drive home, both of us relieved to be putting distance between us and the cabin. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something from that place followed us, something that we can't escape. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, a chance to get away from everything and reconnect with nature. My friends, Mark, Lisa, and I, had found an old campsite deep in the forest, one that hadn't been used in years. The idea of being in such a remote location was exciting, and we quickly made plans to head out there. The drive to the campsite was long and winding, taking us through dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the clearing where the campsite was located. The place looked abandoned, with overgrown grass and trees encroaching on the old fire pit and the remnants of an old wooden cabin. Despite the eerie atmosphere, we were excited to set up camp and start our weekend. The first night at the campsite was uneventful, at least at first. We built a fire, cooked some dinner, and sat around talking and laughing, enjoying the peace and quiet of the forest. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to settle over us. The fire crackled in front of us, but the darkness beyond the circle of light felt impenetrable, almost alive. At one point, I thought I heard a rustling sound in the trees, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I brushed it off as a deer or some other animal and tried to ignore the growing unease that was gnawing at the back of my mind. Later that night, after we had all turned in for the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves and twigs that littered the ground. My heart started racing as I lay there, trying to convince myself it was just one of my friends. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the tent, pausing every few steps, as if someone was listening, waiting. I held my breath, hoping whoever or whatever it was would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be lurking out there in the darkness. The next morning, I asked Mark and Lisa if they had heard anything during the night, but they both shook their heads. They didn't seem concerned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We spent the day exploring the area around the campsite, hiking through the woods and taking in the beauty of the untouched wilderness. But even as we enjoyed the sights and sounds of nature, that nagging sense of unease never left me. The forest felt different, darker, more oppressive. Every now and then, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. That evening, as we sat around the campfire again, the atmosphere felt different. The woods around us were eerily quiet, and the darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides. Lisa mentioned that the place felt strange, almost as if it were watching us. Mark tried to lighten the mood by telling a few ghost stories, but even he seemed to be on edge. As the night wore on, the uneasy feeling grew stronger, and I couldn't shake the sense that we were not alone. Later that night, after we had all gone to bed, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me, but a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from just outside the tent. My heart was pounding in my chest as I lay there, too terrified to move. The growl was followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, snapping branches and crushing leaves underfoot. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would pass by. But instead, it stopped right outside the tent, so close that I could hear it breathing. The air inside the tent felt thick and suffocating, and I was sure that whatever was out there could hear my heart pounding. The next morning, I found that Mark and Lisa had also heard the noises during the night, but none of us could explain what it was. We decided that it might be best to cut the trip short and head home. The unease that had settled over us was too strong to ignore, and we all agreed that something about the place felt wrong. As we packed up our gear, I noticed that the ground around the campsite was disturbed, like something large had been moving through the area during the night. There were deep gouges in the earth, and the underbrush was flattened in several places. As we hiked back to the car, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, but it was always gone before I could get a good look. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful when we arrived, now felt hostile, like it was trying to keep us from leaving. The hike seemed to take much longer than it should have, and by the time we reached the car, we were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. When we finally got back to the car and started driving away, the feeling of unease didn't go away. We drove in silence for a long time, all of us too shaken to talk about what had happened. As we reached the edge of the forest, I looked back one last time and saw a dark figure standing at the edge of the trees watching us. It was tall and thin, with long limbs and a shadowy face. It didn't move, didn't follow us, but its presence sent a chill down my spine. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. We found a small diner and sat down to eat, but none of us had much of an appetite. The events of the weekend weighed heavily on us, and I could tell that Mark and Lisa were just as shaken as I was. As we sat there, Trying to process what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrible. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the dark figure standing there, watching us from a distance. When we finally made it home, I felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept replaying the events of the weekend in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. The footsteps, the growls, the figure in the woods. It all felt like a nightmare, but I knew it had been real. I didn't sleep much that night, and even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed us home from that campsite, something that we can't escape.